There's a particular kind of Sunday morning that only women who live alone truly know. The apartment is quiet, not with the heaviness of loneliness, but with the clarity of complete autonomy. Every surface reflects only her choices. The coffee brews at her preferred strength. The silence isn't broken by compromise or negotiation. No one questions her plans. No one requires her attention. The day unfolds entirely according to her will. For some women, this is freedom. For others, it's a kind of exile they've learned to call independence. And most occupy the space between, never quite certain which story they're living. But Carl Jung saw something in this solitary existence that most modern conversations completely miss. Something that has nothing to do with whether women should or shouldn't live alone, and everything to do with what happens in the psyche when they do. He called it a warning, not a judgment, not a prescription. A warning about a psychological process that accelerates in solitude. One that can lead to profound wholeness or devastating fragmentation depending on a single factor. Whether you face it consciously or let it operate in the dark. In today's video, we'll explore what Jung truly understood about women who live alone, why the usual narratives from both traditionalists and modern feminists miss the deeper psychological truth, and the 5 signs that reveal whether solitude is serving your evolution or quietly undermining it. Because here's what no one tells you. Living alone doesn't make you whole or broken. It simply reveals which one you're becoming. And once you understand what Jung saw, you'll never look at your solitary life the same way again. Number 1. The mirror that disappears. When a woman lives with a partner, she encounters herself constantly through reflection. His reactions show her which parts of herself land well and which create friction. His presence demands she negotiate, compromise, and articulate needs she might otherwise leave unconscious. The relationship acts as a mirror, sometimes flattering, sometimes harsh, but always revealing. Jung understood that we don't discover ourselves in isolation as much as we'd like to believe. We discover ourselves through collision and connection, through the friction of another consciousness rubbing against our own. When that mirror disappears, something profound happens. We're suddenly free to become exactly who we are, unconstrained by another's perception, or we're suddenly lost with no external reference point to know if we're growing or stagnating. I knew a woman, a university professor in her late 30s, who ended a 7-year relationship and moved into a small apartment overlooking the city. For the first 3 months she felt liberated, no one commenting on her work hours, no one sulking when she chose solitude over socializing, no one needing anything from her she wasn't willing to give. But by month 6, something shifted. She noticed she could go entire weekends without speaking to anyone and feel nothing. She could make increasingly selfish decisions and never have to justify them. She could indulge her worst habits, her tendency toward isolation, her avoidance of difficult emotions, her preference for intellectual analysis over embodied feeling, and no one was there to call it out. One evening, a colleague mentioned that she'd become more rigid, less warm, harder to reach. The feedback stung precisely because she'd had no idea. Without the daily mirror of intimate relationship, she'd drifted into patterns she couldn't see. The freedom she'd celebrated had become a kind of psychological isolation where no one could tell her the truth about herself. This is Jung's first warning. When the mirror disappears, you must become your own observer. You must develop a capacity for brutal self-honesty that most people never cultivate, because relationship does this work for them. Women who thrive in solitude have learned to watch themselves with the same clarity a caring partner might. They notice when they're becoming harsh. They catch themselves retreating into comfortable patterns. They actively seek feedback from friends, therapists, or their own reflective practice. Women who struggle in solitude stop seeing themselves clearly because there's no one there to reflect them back. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." But how do you even know what's important when you've lost the mirror that shows you who you're becoming? The absence of a mirror isn't the problem. The problem is not replacing it with something equally honest, because without reflection, we become strangers to ourselves. Number 2. The animus rises from the depths. This is where Jung's psychology becomes essential, because without understanding the animus, you cannot understand what happens to a woman's psyche in prolonged solitude. In Jungian terms, every woman carries within her an inner masculine principle, the animus. It's the part of her that thinks logically, asserts boundaries, makes decisions, takes action, and engages with the external world with directed intention. When a woman is in relationship with a man, she often projects her undeveloped animus onto him. He becomes the one who handles conflict. He makes the difficult decisions. He takes charge in areas where she feels uncertain. This isn't inherently problematic. It's a natural psychological tendency, but it means her own inner masculine remains unconscious, undeveloped, projected outward rather than integrated within. When that man is no longer present, something extraordinary happens. The animus has nowhere to go but inward. She must become her own protector. She must make her own decisions. She must assert her own boundaries. She must engage the world with her own authority. This is the profound opportunity of living alone. It forces the integration of qualities that might have remained forever projected onto someone else. But here's Jung's warning. An unconscious animus doesn't integrate gracefully. It emerges as harsh inner criticism, rigid opinions, cold logic divorced from feeling, or a defensive, combative stance toward the world. Women with unconscious animus often describe an internal voice that's cruel, judgmental, never satisfied, always pointing out flaws. This isn't their authentic masculine strength. It's the shadow side of an undeveloped inner principle. I once worked with a woman in her early 40s who had lived alone for 8 years after a painful divorce. She was successful, independent, and by all external measures, thriving. But internally, she was tormented by what she called the committee, a chorus of harsh voices that criticized every decision, questioned every choice, and left her feeling perpetually inadequate. Through therapy, she began to understand that these voices were her unconscious animus, the masculine principle that had never been properly developed and was now operating destructively in the shadows. She learned to dialogue with this inner figure, asking what it was trying to protect, what strength it wanted her to claim, what capacity it demanded she develop. Over time, the harsh committee transformed into a single, clear voice, still masculine in quality but supportive rather than destructive, directive rather than critical. She described it as finally having an inner ally instead of an inner enemy. This is the integrated animus, strong, clear, protective, but in service to the whole self rather than dominating it. Jung believed that for a woman to become whole, she must integrate her animus consciously. Living alone can accelerate this process, but only if she understands what's happening. If she mistakes the harsh inner voices for truth, if she becomes overly identified with masculine qualities and rejects her feminine nature, if she swings between extreme independence and desperate dependence, then the animus remains split, unconscious, destructive. The question isn't whether you have an animus. Every woman does. The question is whether it serves you or sabotages you. And living alone reveals the answer with ruthless clarity. Number 3. The danger of the untested psyche. Partnership. For all its challenges, tests you constantly. It tests your patience, your capacity for compromise, your ability to hold boundaries while remaining open, your skill at navigating conflict without losing yourself. These tests are uncomfortable, often frustrating, but they force psychological development. They reveal which parts of you are solid and which are merely compensatory. Living alone removes most of these tests. You can structure your entire life around your comfort zone. You can avoid difficult conversations. You can escape conflicts rather than resolving them. You can maintain friendships only with people who validate you and cut off anyone who challenges you. The psyche, like a muscle, only grows through resistance. Remove all resistance and it atrophies. Jung warned about this extensively. He spoke of how people can create elaborate psychological structures that seem sophisticated but are actually just comfortable prisons. A woman living alone might develop an entire philosophy justifying her isolation, convincing herself that she's evolved beyond the need for intimate relationship, when really she's just avoiding the parts of herself that relationship would expose. Think of a tree growing in a greenhouse versus a tree growing on a mountainside. The greenhouse tree grows tall and straight, protected from wind and weather. The mountain tree grows gnarled and strong, shaped by constant resistance. Neither is inherently better, but they develop completely different kinds of strength. Living alone is like the greenhouse. It can be perfect for certain kinds of growth, but only if you're conscious about introducing the resistance that would naturally come from relationship. I've seen this pattern repeatedly. Women who live alone and actively maintain challenging friendships, who seek out difficult conversations, who take on projects that push them beyond their competence, who join communities that demand contribution rather than just consumption, these women grow tremendously in solitude. Their alone time becomes a laboratory for self-development. But women who use living alone as a way to avoid all discomfort, who curate their lives into a perfect bubble of predictable pleasure, who cut off any relationship that requires real work, these women slowly shrink. Their world becomes smaller. Their tolerance for friction decreases. They become increasingly fragile, unable to handle the normal challenges of human existence. There's a woman I know who lives alone and has done so for over a decade. She's one of the most psychologically robust people I've ever met. When I asked her secret, she said something profound. I decided early on that living alone couldn't mean living easy. I had to choose my hard. Partnership is hard in one way. Solitude is hard in another. I chose solitude's hard, which means I never get to hide from myself. I never get to blame anyone else, and I have to actively create the challenges that would come naturally in relationship. She maintains friendships with people who disagree with her. She takes on leadership roles that push her competence. She travels to places that make her uncomfortable. She deliberately engages with ideas that challenge her worldview. She's using solitude as Jung would have wanted, as a crucible for individuation rather than an escape from growth. The danger of the untested psyche is that it feels strong until life tests it and reveals it was only protected. Jung's warning is this: if you live alone, you must become your own crucible. You must choose challenges that hurt. You must seek feedback that stings. You must maintain relationships that require real work. Because without these tests, you're not developing. You're just staying comfortable. And comfort, in the long run, is the opposite of growth. Number 4. Solitude versus isolation. And most women can't tell the difference. This might be Jung's most critical insight about living alone. There's a profound difference between solitude and isolation, but they can look identical from the outside and feel very similar from the inside, especially at first. Solitude is chosen, conscious and restorative. It's a withdrawal from the world to reconnect with yourself, to integrate experiences, to hear your own voice beneath the noise. Isolation is unconscious, compulsive, and depleting. It's a retreat from the world because the world feels threatening, overwhelming, or because you've lost the capacity to connect authentically. Here's the dangerous part. You can live alone in solitude for years, genuinely using the space for growth and integration. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, it can shift into isolation. The line between them isn't fixed. It's a constant choice, a daily practice of remaining connected to life even while living apart from constant company. Jung wrote extensively about this in his concept of participation mystique, the unconscious connection to the collective that healthy individuals maintain even in solitude. When this connection severs, when a woman becomes so enclosed in her private world that she loses touch with the pulse of life beyond her walls, she enters what Jung called psychic isolation. It's a state where she's no longer participating in life, but merely observing it, no longer connected to the collective unconscious but floating in a private fantasy. The signs are subtle. You stop wanting to share your inner world with anyone because it feels too precious, too private, too misunderstood. You begin to prefer your own company exclusively, not because you're genuinely content but because engaging with others feels like a burden. Your daily routines become sacred rituals that can't be interrupted. Your apartment becomes a perfect ecosystem that you protect from any intrusion. Your thoughts circle in familiar patterns without the disruption of other perspectives. I watched this happen to a brilliant artist who moved to a remote cabin to focus on her work. For the first 2 years, the solitude fed her creativity. Her paintings deepened, her vision clarified. But by year 3, something had shifted. Her work became increasingly hermetic, filled with private symbols no one else could interpret. She spoke less to friends. She stopped exhibiting. She convinced herself that the world wasn't ready for her vision, when really, she'd lost the capacity to translate her inner world into something shareable. When a mutual friend finally visited, she found the woman living in a beautiful but eerie isolation. Every surface covered with her work, no outside input, no fresh perspectives, just an endless loop of her own consciousness creating, interpreting, and validating itself. This is psychic isolation, and it's one of Jung's deepest warnings about solitary existence. The antidote is what Jung called active relationship with the collective. This doesn't mean you need to be surrounded by people. It means you maintain genuine, challenging, mutual relationships, where you give and receive, where you're seen and you see others, where your inner world encounters other inner worlds and both are enriched by the collision. It means your creative work, your thoughts, your insights flow back into the world rather than circulating endlessly within. Women who live in healthy solitude have lives that breathe. They withdraw to be alone, then return to connection. They develop insights in silence, then share them in dialogue. They structure their days around their own rhythms, but those rhythms include regular contact with the messy, unpredictable reality of other humans. Their solitude serves their connection, and their connection enriches their solitude. Women who drift into isolation have lives that hold their breath. Everything becomes interior. Everything becomes private. Everything becomes so precious and fragile that contact with the world feels like contamination rather than enrichment. And slowly, without realizing it, they've built a beautiful prison. Ask yourself honestly, does your alone time feed your capacity for connection, or is it slowly eroding it? Do you return to the world refreshed, or do you increasingly resent having to leave your private sanctuary? This is how you know whether you're in solitude or isolation. And the answer matters more than almost anything else. If you recognize this pattern, if you see yourself in the space between solitude and isolation, let me know you're here by typing the word present in the comments. It's not an admission of failure, it's a sign you're aware enough to catch yourself before the drift becomes permanent. And awareness, Jung taught, is the first step toward integration. Number 5. The shadow that grows in silence. This is perhaps Jung's most urgent warning, and the one most women living alone never see coming. Your shadow, everything you've disowned about yourself, everything you refuse to acknowledge, everything you've decided you're not, grows most powerfully in the absence of relationship, because relationship, whether you like it or not, constantly surfaces your shadow. Your partner sees the parts of you that you hide from yourself. Conflicts reveal your unconscious patterns. Intimacy exposes your defenses. Living alone removes this inconvenient mirror. You can maintain your self-image without contradiction. If you see yourself as kind, you never have to confront your capacity for cruelty because no one's there to receive it. If you see yourself as independent, you never face your hidden dependencies because there's no one to depend on. If you see yourself as healed and evolved, you never encounter the parts of you that remain wounded and reactive. Jung was explicit about this danger. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Living alone creates perfect conditions for the shadow to become very black and very dense indeed, because it operates entirely in the unconscious without the friction of relationship to bring it to light." I've seen this manifest in countless ways. A woman who prides herself on her rationality, living alone, never confronting how deeply emotional and irrational she becomes when her worldview is challenged because she's structured her life to avoid such challenges. A woman who sees herself as generous and open-hearted, living alone, never facing how selfish and closed she's become because there's no one in her daily life whose needs conflict with her own. A woman who believes she's moved beyond her painful past, living alone, never recognizing that she's simply avoided any situation that would trigger those old wounds. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you're not in relationship. It goes underground. And from underground it operates with even more power, shaping your choices in ways you can't see, narrowing your world to accommodate what you refuse to face, emerging in projections onto others, or sudden inexplicable reactions that seem to come from nowhere. There's a practice Jung recommended specifically for this situation, and it's one of the most valuable tools for women living alone. He called it active imagination. It's a process of consciously dialoguing with the parts of yourself you've disowned, giving them voice, letting them speak their truth even when it contradicts your preferred self-image. A woman I know practices this with fierce dedication. Every week she sits down and asks herself the question, what am I refusing to see about myself right now? Then she writes without censoring, letting whatever emerges come through. Sometimes it's brutal. Sometimes she discovers she's been cruel when she thought she was honest. Sometimes she finds neediness where she thought there was strength. Sometimes she recognizes manipulation where she thought there was generosity. This practice isn't comfortable. It's the opposite of the self-affirming journaling many people do. But it serves the same function that relationship serves, bringing the shadow to light, making the unconscious conscious, preventing the slow drift into a carefully curated but fundamentally dishonest self-image. Women who integrate their shadow while living alone become remarkably whole. They can hold complexity. They're not attached to being seen as good or evolved. They can acknowledge their pettiness, their jealousy, their fear, their capacity for harm without it destroying their sense of self. This is psychological maturity, the ability to say, yes, that's also me, without shame or defensiveness. Women who avoid their shadow while living alone become increasingly one-dimensional. They have to work harder and harder to maintain their self-image. They become rigid, defensive, unable to tolerate feedback. They surround themselves only with people who reflect back the version of themselves they want to see. And beneath it all, the shadow grows, waiting for the crisis that will finally force it into consciousness. Jung's warning is this: living alone removes the natural mechanism by which most people encounter their shadow. If you don't replace that mechanism with something equally honest, your shadow doesn't go away. It just gains power in the dark. And one day, often years later, it emerges in ways you can't control, through illness, addiction, sudden destructive choices, or a complete psychological breakdown. The gift of living alone is that you can do this shadow work at your own pace, in your own way, without the chaos of a relationship forcing it. The danger is that you can also avoid it entirely, building a comfortable life on a foundation of everything you refuse to acknowledge. Which path are you on? Only you know. But the question is worth asking every single day. So what was Jung really warning about? After exploring these 5 patterns, we can finally understand the true nature of Jung's warning. He wasn't saying women shouldn't live alone. He wasn't advocating for traditional relationship structures. He wasn't suggesting women need men to be complete. His warning was far more subtle and far more profound. He was saying that living alone amplifies whatever psychological work you're already doing or avoiding. If you're committed to self-knowledge, solitude becomes the most powerful crucible for transformation. If you're committed to self-deception, solitude becomes the perfect hiding place. The absence of a partner doesn't create these tendencies, it reveals them, it accelerates them, it makes them impossible to ignore if you're willing to look. Think of it like this. Imagine a house with many rooms. Some are bright and well-furnished, the parts of yourself you know and accept. Some are dark and locked, the shadow material you refuse to face. In relationship, your partner inevitably drags you into those locked rooms. They trigger your wounds. They expose your defenses. They force you to confront what you'd rather avoid. It's painful, but it's also how integration happens. Living alone, you have complete control over which rooms you enter. You can spend years in the bright, comfortable spaces, never venturing into the darkness. Or you can deliberately, consciously, choose to unlock those doors yourself. You can become the one who explores the full house, who integrates all the rooms into a coherent whole. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating all aspects of the psyche into a unified self. Living alone can be the most direct path to individuation for certain women at certain times, but it requires a level of consciousness, honesty, and deliberate psychological work that most people, if we're being honest, never achieve. The women who succeed at this, who use solitude as a vehicle for profound transformation, share certain qualities. They're ruthlessly honest with themselves. They actively seek discomfort and challenge. They maintain deep, authentic relationships, even while living alone. They have practices that surface their shadow, whether through therapy, creative work, meditation, or active imagination. They regularly examine their patterns rather than defending them. They're willing to be wrong about themselves. These women emerge from years of solitude more psychologically integrated than most people in long-term relationships. They've done the work that partnership often allows people to avoid. They know themselves thoroughly. They can hold both their strength and their weakness without denial. They're genuinely autonomous, not in the sense of needing no one, but in the sense of being whole within themselves. The women who fail at this, who use solitude as an escape rather than a crucible, often don't realize what's happening until years have passed. They become comfortable in their isolation. Their world shrinks. Their tolerance for challenge decreases. They develop elaborate justifications for their choices that sound sophisticated but are really just defenses. They lose touch with their shadow, their animus, their connection to the collective, and one day they look around and realize they've built a beautiful but lonely prison. Jung's warning isn't a judgment. It's an invitation to consciousness. He's saying if you're going to live alone, know what you're entering. Know the opportunities and the dangers. Know that without the automatic psychological friction of relationship, you must create that friction deliberately. Know that your shadow won't surface on its own. You'll have to go looking for it. Know that integration requires work that feels unnecessary until the day you realize it was the only thing that mattered. And here's the profound truth beneath all of this. The work Jung described, the integration of the shadow, the development of the animus, the maintenance of authentic connection, the conscious navigation between solitude and isolation, this work is required regardless of your living situation. Partnership doesn't exempt you from it. It just provides different conditions for doing it. Some women need the solitude to do this work properly. Some need the structure and friction of partnership. Some need to move between both across different life stages. None of these choices is inherently superior. The only question that matters is whether you're becoming more whole or more fragmented, more conscious or more defended, more alive or more numb. So return for a moment to that Sunday morning we opened with, the quiet apartment, the coffee brewing, the day unfolding entirely according to her will. Now you can see it differently. Is this woman using her solitude to integrate what relationship would have forced her to face? Or is she using it to avoid what she's not yet ready to confront? Is her peace the result of genuine psychological work, or is it the temporary comfort of a carefully controlled environment? Jung would say both are possible. Both are real. And which one you're living depends entirely on the level of consciousness you bring to your solitary existence. The warning isn't that you shouldn't be there. The warning is that being there reveals everything. And whether that revelation leads to wholeness or fragmentation is entirely up to you. Because in the end, living alone isn't the point. Becoming whole is the point. And for some women at some times, the path to wholeness runs directly through the center of profound, conscious, deliberate solitude. If that's your path, walk it with eyes open. Jung's warning isn't there to stop you. It's there to help you see where you're actually going.